Welcome back, AP Psych. We are on to our last two topics of our final unit on social psychology. Today we're going to touch on antisocial relations, and then we'll wrap up next with pro-social relations, and that'll be it. So we're going to focus on antisocial relations today, with mostly prejudice and aggression will be our two main topics. And just reminding you that antisocial in a psychological sense does not mean that you like to avoid other people, you're introverted, and you don't want to go out and see people. It's all about impacting society or your community in a negative way and doing things that harm others, right? In that sense, that's what we mean by antisocial. Okay, so let's jump into our first topic, which is prejudice. So this stuff is pretty heavy, but understanding these antisocial aspects of social psychology can help us combat them and hopefully overcome them in ourselves if we experience them as well. So with prejudice, this is simply a prejudgment. Right? A prejudice is an unjustifiable, usually negative attitude towards a group and the members within that group. Okay, so it's unjustifiable, usually negative, and oftentimes it's directed at a different culture, a different ethnicity, a different gender, a different race, something like that. Those are where prejudice are usually directed. There's a few components that we'll discuss. First, your belief is the beginning of your prejudice, and that's your stereotype of a group, right? Then you feel emotions when you have those beliefs. You feel hostility or envy or fear that trigger, your predisposition to act or to discriminate. Okay, so these are the elements of prejudice, but it's important to note also that prejudice is just those beliefs and those emotions, those feelings and those thoughts, and it's very much separate from discrimination, which is acting upon your predisposition or your prejudice. So where does prejudice originate and come from? We talked about it a little bit on the previous slide, but prejudice kind of works at the conscious and the unconscious level. So we can both have a conscious prejudice against certain groups, but we also may have unconscious prejudices and biases that we're unaware of. Okay, so prejudice can be more like a knee-jerk reaction or response than a conscious decision, in the opinion of most psychologists and sociologists. And there have been many studies done on this that show that almost all of us have some type of unconscious prejudice or bias in our lives, and it's important to understand, maybe where that comes from, and just discover that so you can help combat it in yourself. So some causes. Where do these prejudices arise from? Well, there's social inequalities, the haves versus the have-nots. Maybe people who are more well-off in the world are trying to, justify, the reason that they are in a better position. So those social inequalities can lead to prejudice. Social divisions and identities. Right? We talked about race, culture, gender. Those things are our identities, but also social divisions like different class structure, working class, middle class, upper class, things like that can cause prejudice and divisions. We have emotional scapegoating, blaming other people for potentially your problems and issues or the issues of your society. And then your thought patterns or your cognition, the way you think about things and people and the stereotypes that you hold and the biases that you have impact your prejudice. So we'll talk about a few of these going forward to help us understand where prejudice comes from. So first, social identities. We all have what's called in and out groups in our lives. Right? Our in group is the people with whom we share a common identity. Right? That makes you us. Whenever you're talking about us, whoever you're speaking of, that's an in group, right? The people that you spend time with, you interact with, and you identify with. On the flip side, anytime you're creating an us situation, you're also creating a them situation. And the out group is those perceived as different from one's in group. That's the them, right? Who are they over there? What are they doing? That's not what we do, right? You're creating an out group. In group bias is the tendency to favor one's own group. Okay? And this favoritism, right, is where prejudice can arise, right, by creating and favoring your in-group over the out-group. Now, oftentimes, like we mentioned before, much more serious examples of this deal with race, class, gender, ethnic group, things like that. Much more basic example that we experience all the time is sports, college sports, professional sports, things like that. Being a graduate of Ohio State, my in-group is Buckeyes, right? And my out-group, people that I don't like to associate with, and I think are different from myself, are Michigan fans, right? Because of that major rivalry that we have. And that's obviously oversimplifying what can be a very serious issue, but we create in-groups and out-groups almost constantly in different areas of our lives. Okay. So that's one way prejudice can arise. Another are social identities. So there's an example of this through Jane Elliott's blue eye and brown eye experiment. In 1968, after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., she was teaching in rural Iowa, and her third grade students, most of them white, didn't really understand the issues and the prejudice and the discrimination being experienced by African Americans in the United States. So she wanted to help them understand why this was such a big event and why someone in the first place would want to assassinate or kill another person, and why so many people were experiencing sadness over that fact. So she went out and set out to try to show children how prejudice and discrimination can have such a negative impact. So she separated her class by eye color. She had a blue-eyed group and a brown-eyed group. And she gave one group privileges and special treatment, and treated the other group with contempt and disdain. And almost immediately, the students latched onto that. And students who were best friends prior to this experiment in the same day were treating each other like trash, right? And it started to show and connect with those kids the impact that prejudice and discrimination can have by separating people based upon physical characteristics and culture and things like that. So in addition to those social identities, we have scapegoat theory. And this is where prejudice provides an outlet for anger by providing someone to blame. Right? And we've seen plenty of examples of this throughout history. Right? And these are just a couple that may be familiar to you. Right? Something's going on, you can't control it. You want to blame someone else so that you can feel better. Japanese American internment after Pearl Harbor. Right? That's an example of scapegoat theory. Blaming the Jews for German problems prior to World War II. And in the United States again, after 9/11, many people lashed out against innocent Arab Americans because they needed a place to vent their anger, right? An outlet for their anger. And that's what scapegoat theory allows you to do. So our last thing to talk about where prejudice originates from is our cognitive roots, our thought patterns. Okay? Our brains love to use shortcuts, right? Think about heuristics, and they love to organize through our schemas and our concepts. So one way we simplify our world is to categorize things to make it easier for us to think through them. So we categorize people into groups by easily identifiable traits. Right? So we're grouping people by things we can easily identify, and then we start to stereotype those groups based upon those traits and the few experiences that we've had with them. Right? And this leads to patterns of thought that we create within our minds. So this tendency, in addition to cognitive roots, the tendency of people to believe the world is just and therefore people get what they deserve and deserve what they get, is part of the cognitive roots of prejudice, right? If you believe in a just world or the just world phenomenon, then you're going to believe that, this person's life, they've had these bad things happen to them. Well, they must have deserved it because the world is just in a way, right? This can oftentimes be a big issue in terms of when we talk about victim blaming in cases of, very serious things like rape, sexual assault, murder, right? Stuff like that. Well, they must have deserved it for some reason. They got what they deserved. This is a just world that we live in. Right? And it's a way for people to rationalize and get through what happens in life, especially for people who are the big fish in the world. The world is just, right? They're doing well, so they think they deserve to be doing well, whereas the people on the other end may not have this same view as a just world. So how do we reduce these things and these prejudices that are caused by those things we just discussed? Well, one hypothesis is something called the contact hypothesis. And this is how we can reduce stereotypes and prejudice as contact with the group that we are stereotyping or prejudiced against increases, right? If you want to get people to discriminate less against a certain group, have them interact more, have them meet each other, talk, get past the stereotypical part and get to know each other. Now, that helps. It's a starting point, but most research has shown that it's not enough. It's part of the solution, but there also needs to be education to address your social thoughts and perceptions in addition to the contact, right? There needs to be a way to change these thoughts and beliefs. Now, moving from prejudice to aggression, our second part of antisocial relations. So aggression is any physical or verbal behavior intended to hurt or destroy. So a lot of people forget aggression doesn't have to be just a pure physical fighting, right? It can be verbal as well, verbally assaulting someone, things like that. So can be done reactively out of hostility, like immediately in the situation, or it can be proactive. You can calculate it, kind of like premeditated, means to an end. Right? So research has shown that aggressive behavior emerges from the interaction of biology and experience. So it's going to be both nature and nurture that helps to develop aggression across people and across cultures. So first up, let's talk about the nature part of aggression. There are genetic influences. Animals have been bred for aggressiveness. You think about dogfighting and those unfortunate things that occur there for sport and at times for research. Twin studies show that aggression may be genetic, right? And in men specifically, aggression is possibly linked to the Y chromosome. Now, on the neural side, the brain side, some centers in the brain, especially the limbic system, the amygdala, right, the center for fear and anger, and the frontal lobe, are all intimately involved with aggression and causing and expressing aggressive behavior. Another biological influence would be the biochemical influences. Animals with diminished amounts of testosterone, because of castration, for example, become more docile. And if injected with testosterone, their aggression increases. So we know that testosterone, that hormone, plays a huge role in aggression. Prenatal exposure to testosterone also increased aggression in female hyenas, right? So we know that there are some chemical influences when we talk about the biological influences of aggression. Now, what about the nurture side of things, right? Cultural mechanisms that impact our aggressiveness. So when aggression leads to desired outcomes, one learns to be aggressive, right? Think about that. That's like operant conditioning, right? You're being rewarded for this behavior, so you're going to continue to do that behavior and become more aggressive as a result because you get what you want. So this is seen more in individualistic cultures than collectivist cultures. Collectivist cultures usually put an emphasis on the success of society and the community above themselves, so there's less aggression. Cultures that do have undertones of violence have a huge impact on violent tendencies in a population. So if you're coming from a background or an area where violence is commonplace, you're more likely to engage in it. Think about the Bobo doll experiment. When young people, children, were exposed to adults beating up on the Bobo doll, and then they mimicked that observational learning. The more you see that as you grow and develop, the more likely you are to engage in it yourself. So when are people aggressive? So we've talked about the biological and cultural impacts on why you might be aggressive, but when does it usually occur? Well, there's the frustration aggression principle. And this is a principle in which frustration, because you can't reach some type of goal, right? You're blocked from reaching a goal in your life. And so you get angry about it, which can generate then aggression and lashing out. So in other words, people won't be aggressive unless they get frustrated by something. And we've all experienced that idea before, where something frustrates you and then you kind of lash out for some reason. And maybe, if there's someone who had nothing to do with it, that becomes an collateral in that situation. Well, most research has shown that this is a little bit too simplistic and general of a theory. It needs a little bit more depth and needs to be researched a little further. But they do agree that the direct cause of these kinds of aggression is a negative affect or a negative emotion. So negative emotions plays a huge role in eventually developing into aggressive behavior. Second theory here is the excitation transfer. And this would be arousal from one experience may carry over to an independent situation. Okay, so the key is that this independent situation must trigger your aggression. All right, so let's say you just got back from a high intensity workout, heart rate's up, you had some adrenaline pumping to get through that workout, and you walk in the door and your brother insults you. Your body's aroused, you're already in that situation. You're more likely to respond aggressively because you're already in a heightened state. Okay, so that would be that excitation transfer theory of aggression. So a couple other things here. Aversive events may lead to aggression. So studies in which animals and humans experience unpleasant events reveal that those made miserable often make others miserable. So when people are being treated poorly, they're being bullied, they're experiencing negative things in their day-to-day life, then they're more likely to lash out and be aggressive towards others to make them miserable as well. One famous example of this would be the Malice in the Palace. Have you ever heard of that? Indiana Pacers and the Detroit Pistons were playing a basketball game, and a basketball player named Ron Artest was being heckled by the crowd. And eventually somebody in the crowd threw a cup of beer and landed on him, and it started this massive melee of fans and players in an aggressive fight, right? This aversive situation or event led to an extremely huge display of aggressive behavior. And our last thing here, stressful environments, okay? Living, working in stressful environments can increase aggression. So for example, things like high temperatures, air pollution, and noise have all been found to increase aggressive tendencies. This would be why, aside from, higher population density, why there is higher crime rates in major cities. Okay? Air pollution and noise are all increased there. And this would also be why crime rates in major cities increase drastically in the summer as temperatures rise. And you can see that here in Houston, Texas, one of the 5 biggest cities in America. Their murder and rapes per day go up significantly as the temperature rises in summertime. Right? We don't like to be uncomfortable. When we're uncomfortable, oftentimes we get upset, we get frustrated, and that can lead to aggressive lashing out. So that kind of wraps up our antisocial, the major concepts of antisocial relations that we needed to cover. We'll finish up with prosocial relations, and we'll get to see some of the inverse of a lot of these negative things we just talked about and see the positive side of human nature to wrap up our unit. As usual, if you got any questions, let me know.